There is a moment inside every powerful family, and it does not matter if that family lives in a palace or a farmhouse, when the silence becomes louder than anything that has ever been said out loud. It is the moment when someone crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed, when a decision is made in a quiet room that will echo through years and years of dinners, ceremonies, photographs, and carefully rehearsed smiles. Most families never speak about that moment publicly. They bury it under polite conversation and pressed suits and forced laughter at Christmas tables and anniversary photographs. But inside the stone walls of Windsor Castle, in the early months of 2025, that moment arrived. And this time, it did not stay buried. This time, the people closest to the crown watched it unfold. And the silence that followed said everything that the official statements never would. What you are about to hear is not a tabloid rumor. It is not a headline designed to make you click and forget. It is the story of a prince who made a decision that shook the private world of the British royal family to its foundations. A decision about loyalty, about protection, about the very meaning of who belongs inside those gates and who does not. And it is the story of the one senior royal who, without saying a word to the cameras, made clear which side of that line she was standing on. To understand what Prince William did, and why he did it, you first have to understand the kind of man he has become. Because the William who stood inside Windsor Castle in the spring of 2025 was not the same William the world watched grow up in the shadow of his mother's grief. He was not the boy who walked behind Diana's coffin with his eyes locked forward, because if he looked sideways, he would fall apart. He was not the young man who spent his early 20s trying to be ordinary, who flew search and rescue helicopters in Wales, who married Catherine Middleton in a ceremony that made an entire planet stop and hold its breath. That William still lived somewhere deep inside him, protected and real. But on the outside, standing in a private wing of Windsor Castle with the weight of a future kingdom pressing down on his shoulders, he had become something else entirely. He had become a man who understood, more than almost anyone alive on this earth, what it costs to protect the people you love inside a system that was never designed with love as its first priority. The British royal family is not like other families. It never has been. It is an institution first, a bloodline second, and a collection of human beings somewhere further down that list. Every person born into it or married into it learns this truth eventually, some gently and some brutally. The rules are not always written down. Many of the most important ones are passed through glances across formal dinner tables, through the particular tone of a private secretary's voice, through the architecture of who sits where and who gets invited and who quietly does not. William had been absorbing those rules his entire life. He had watched his mother absorb them and then refuse them, and he had watched what that refusal cost her in ways that the public understood only partially and the family understood completely. He had watched his brother absorb them and then detonate them publicly, and he had watched what that cost everyone in the institution, including people who never asked to be part of that particular story at all. So when something happened at Windsor Castle in the spring of 2025 that required William to make a choice, he did not make it quickly, and he did not make it loudly. He made it with the deliberate, measured certainty of a man who had been rehearsing for exactly this kind of moment his entire adult life, even if he had never known the specific shape it would take. Camilla Parker Bowles became Queen Consort in May 2023 when King Charles was crowned at Westminster Abbey in a ceremony that millions watched on television and that the history books will record with careful neutrality. Her journey to that crown had been one of the most publicly debated and privately contentious in modern British history. For decades, she had been the name that people said when they wanted to explain what went wrong between Charles and Diana. For decades, she had carried that weight in public, at official functions, in newspaper headlines, in the particular way strangers sometimes looked at her across rooms. And then, gradually and unmistakably, things shifted. She became a working royal of considerable skill and quiet determination. She built a record of genuine charitable work. She mastered the difficult art of being present without overreaching, of being beside Charles without overshadowing him. By the time the crown was placed on her head, much of the public had arrived at something like grudging respect, if not outright warmth. But acceptance in the press and acceptance inside the private chambers of Windsor Castle are two very different things. The royal family is layered in ways that outsiders rarely understand. There is the public layer, the wave, the engagement, the carefully worded statement delivered outside a hospital or a cathedral. And there is the private layer where old loyalties live like roots beneath the ground, invisible to cameras and enormously powerful. Camilla was accepted publicly. Whether she was ever fully accepted in every private room, at every private table, in the kind of unrehearsed moments that happen when the press has gone home and the doors are closed, that is a question the people who know the answer will likely never answer directly, at least not while certain people are still alive. What Camilla brought with her into the royal family, beyond her own history and her own complicated standing, were her children and her grandchildren. Her son Tom Parker Bowles has largely stayed away from the formal machinery of royal life. Her daughter Laura Lopes has done the same. They are not working royals. They do not carry titles. They attend some occasions and stay away from others, and for the most part the arrangement functions because everyone understands the unspoken geography of it. You are connected to this family, but you are not of it, and that distinction is important. Camilla's grandchildren, the children of Tom and Laura, exist in a similar position. They are the Queen's grandchildren by the structure of marriage, which gives them proximity to something enormous and visible and historically significant. But it does not give them standing within it, and it does not give them the protections or the accountability that standing would bring. Freddie Parker Bowles, Camilla's grandson through her daughter Laura Lopes, had been present at Windsor on various occasions over the years. Family gatherings, seasonal events, the kind of informal moments that happen behind closed gates and rarely make the newspapers. He was a teenager navigating a position that is genuinely unusual in the modern world, close enough to royalty to be present at some of its most intimate private moments, but not royal himself, not bound by the specific discipline and training and awareness that the Wales children have been absorbing since they were small enough to be carried. That gap, between proximity and belonging, between access and accountability, is one of the most treacherous spaces in any institution. It creates a particular kind of confidence, sometimes a particular kind of carelessness, that can tip, under the wrong conditions, into something more consequential than anyone intended. The incident that changed everything reportedly took place during what should have been an unremarkable private gathering at Windsor in the early months of 2025. The Wales children were present, as they often were during family occasions at the castle, George, Charlotte, and Louis, navigating the specific business of being children who will one day be required to carry extraordinary things. Prince George, 13 years old that year and already beginning to absorb the particular weight of being the future King of England, was among a small group of young people who occupied that unusual space around the royal household. What happened between George and Freddie Parker Bowles that evening is not something that has been officially confirmed in any palace statement. No spokesperson has stood at a podium and described it. No official inquiry has been announced. What sources describe to people close to the family, in careful and sometimes deliberately vague terms, is that there was an incident. That something was said or done that went beyond the ordinary friction of young people sharing a space. That Prince George was affected by it in a way that did not go unnoticed by the adults around him, and that the nature of what happened was the kind of thing that, once reported to a father who takes seriously the business of protecting his children, was never going to simply disappear into the endless folder of things the royal family has quietly absorbed over the years. William found out. He always finds out because the people around him understand what their responsibilities are. His household, the staff and aides who manage the daily mechanics of his life and the lives of his children, know that there are certain categories of information that go directly to him without delay. When something happens that touches his children, not in a logistical sense, but in a personal one in a way that involves their dignity or their well-being, that information reaches him. It reached him in this case. And William, who does not make decisions impulsively, and does not raise his voice when a quiet word in a private room will accomplish more, began to think through exactly what the right response looked like. He did not call an immediate meeting. He did not summon anyone that same evening in a way that would have generated the kind of internal palace rumor that spreads through corridors and reaches ears it was never meant to reach. What he did was think. He thought about his children and what it means to grow up inside this institution with its particular extraordinary pressures, to be a child who cannot simply have a bad day and move on because every bad day is potentially somebody's story. He thought about the difference between the access that some people around the edges of the royal family were granted and the accountability that was supposed to come alongside that access. He thought about what message it would send to his children, to his household, to the institution itself, if this incident was absorbed quietly and filed away under the heading of complicated family dynamics, which was the easiest thing to do. He decided that it was also the wrong thing to do. He thought about his mother. He thought about the many times Diana had been expected to absorb things quietly, to fold difficulty into herself and smooth over the surface, and present the appropriate face for the appropriate occasion. He thought about the pattern that created, the specific damage that pattern did to a woman he had loved completely and lost too early. He thought about how that pattern continued itself unless someone decided to stop it. And he decided, sitting with this particular situation and everything it meant, that this was not a pattern he intended to continue. Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, is not a woman who performs warmth for cameras or says things she does not mean for the sake of appearing agreeable. She has spent more than 5 decades being one of the most formidably effective members of the British royal family, logging more public engagements per year than almost any other working royal for decades upon decades, doing it with a crisp, no-nonsense efficiency that does not require applause and has never seemed to want it. She is respected inside the institution in a particular way, not the celebrity respect that attaches to William or to the memory of Diana, but the deep, structural respect that comes from having shown up, done the work, kept quiet about the parts that deserved quiet, and spoken when speaking was necessary. She is someone whose opinion carries weight precisely because she does not give it casually. William and Anne have always had a specific kind of connection within the family. Not the easiest or the most demonstrative relationship, neither of them operates that way, but a connection built on a shared understanding of what the work requires and a shared impatience with anything that interferes with it. They are practical people surrounded by a great deal of complicated theater, and practical people tend to find each other in large institutions the same way water finds the lowest point of a room. When William was thinking through his response to the Windsor incident, Anne was one of a very small number of people he spoke with. He did not consult a committee. He did not involve the Palace Communications Office or ask for a risk assessment or sit through a briefing about potential optics. He spoke with Anne because her judgment was something he trusted, because her understanding of the institution stretched back further than his own, and because her loyalty to what the Crown actually stood for, not the performance of it, but the substance of it, was not something that had ever been in question. Anne listened. She did not offer a long diplomatic speech. She did not provide a careful list of pros and cons or warn him to consider the family implications or suggest that patience might be advisable. She said something direct, brief, and honest, in the manner of a woman who had long ago concluded that the most useful thing she could give the people she respected was her actual opinion. And what she said, by every account that has emerged from those who were aware of this conversation, aligned completely with what William had already decided. Not because she told him what to do. William does not need to be told, but because her agreement confirmed what he already knew, that what he was about to do was right, and that the institution would be better for it, even if the immediate days were going to be uncomfortable. Within a matter of days following that conversation, a decision was communicated through the appropriate internal channels. Freddie Parker Bowles would no longer be welcome at Windsor Castle. There was no official announcement. There was no press release sent to royal correspondents. There was no statement from Buckingham Palace. In the way that these things are done inside this institution, quietly, firmly, without ceremony, and without the possibility of negotiation, the access was revoked. The unspoken geography of who belonged inside those gates was redrawn. And Windsor Castle, which has stood through centuries of far larger upheavals and far more dramatic confrontations than this one, absorbed the decision into itself and continued as it always does. But inside the family, things did not simply continue. Inside the private world of the monarchy, behind the doors that the cameras never reach and the statements never describe, the ripples from what William had done were only beginning to spread. Because when a prince who is heir to the throne makes a decision of this nature, not a political decision, not a public decision, but a deeply personal one about loyalty and protection and access, it does not stay contained to the single moment of its making. It travels, it reaches people, it changes things, and the people it was going to change most were not the ones anyone was watching. The news of what William had done moved through the private world of the royal household the way all serious things move through it, not in announcements, but in absences, in invitations that were not extended, in a name that disappeared from a certain kind of conversation. In the particular, practiced silence that the people around the monarchy have perfected over generations, the silence that says more than any statement ever could, and says it to exactly the people it is meant to reach. Camilla learned what had happened. Whatever the exact mechanism of that communication, whether it came through a private secretary or through a family conversation or through the specific, unmistakable language of institutional signal, she understood. She understood that her grandson had been excluded from Windsor. She understood that the exclusion had come from William. And she understood, as a woman who had spent most of her adult life learning to read the intricate interior language of this particular family, that this was not a temporary measure, not a cooling-off period, not something that a careful conversation over time would reverse. William does not make reversible decisions of this nature. When he decides something is necessary, he decides it completely. How Camilla responded in those private days is not something that has been described in any official account, because there are no official accounts of this kind of thing. What those close to the family have described is a woman trying to manage something that touched simultaneously on her role as a grandmother, her role as queen, and her position inside a family that had never been entirely simple for her to navigate even in the best of circumstances. She could not publicly contest what William had done. There was no forum for that, no mechanism by which a queen consort challenges the Prince of Wales over a private household decision without creating the kind of public spectacle that would damage everyone involved, including herself. She could not privately press him in a way that would change his mind, because William had made his mind up before he acted, which is always how he does it. What she could do, and what she apparently did, was absorb the situation with the same outward composure that she had been applying to difficult situations for most of her life. But composure is not the same as acceptance, and the people around Camilla who knew her well enough to read beyond the composure understood that what had happened was not something she was going to simply let go of inside herself, even if it never emerged in any way that the press or the public would see. A grandmother is a grandmother regardless of the title she carries. And the feeling of watching a grandchild be excluded from something, regardless of the reason and regardless of whether the reason is understandable, does not vanish because it is politically inconvenient to acknowledge it. Inside the wider royal family, people were paying attention in the careful, quiet way that people always pay attention when the balance of something shifts. The Wales household had always occupied a specific position in the structure of the family. Important, obviously. Central, obviously. The future of the entire institution in a direct and unavoidable sense. But power inside a family is not only about formal position. It is about the choices a person makes, and whether those choices are backed up by people who matter. When William made this decision, and it became known, through the silent machinery of institutional communication, that Anne was aligned with him, that the Princess Royal, with her decades of service and her legendary impatience with anything less than institutional integrity, had not contested what he had done, it changed something. It changed what people understood about where the real weight inside the family currently resided. King Charles was aware of what had happened. That is not something that requires sourcing or confirmation. Charles is aware of what happens in his household and in the households of his family members, because the apparatus around him exists in part to ensure that he is. How he felt about it is a more complicated question. Charles has spent his entire life trying to hold together a family that has often wanted to fly apart, to balance personal feelings against institutional requirements in a way that satisfies neither completely but avoids catastrophe. He loves Camilla. That is not in question and has not been for a long time. He also understands William, perhaps better than William knows, because he recognizes in his son's particular brand of quiet, decisive action something of himself at his most purposeful. The situation required Charles to hold two things at once: his affection for his wife and the pain she was experiencing privately, and his understanding that what William had done was, at its core, an act of fatherhood, which is a category of action that Charles has always regarded with a particular kind of respect, perhaps because his own history as a father is complicated enough that he does not take it lightly. Charles did not intervene. He could have. There are those who believe he should have that the role of a king and a patriarch includes brokering exactly this kind of internal conflict before it hardens into something less manageable. But Charles, who has learned to pick his interventions carefully because he has also learned the cost of choosing wrong, stepped back. He expressed his care for Camilla in private. He acknowledged to William in the specific and unspoken language of their relationship that he understood, and he left the situation as William had left it, resolved in its essential fact, complex in its emotional aftermath, and entirely out of the public eye. What was happening out of the public eye in those weeks after the decision had been made was something that those closest to the family would later describe as a quiet realignment. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a summit, but a gradual, steady process by which certain people inside the royal world were reorienting themselves around the new shape of things, understanding which relationships had been strengthened by this episode and which had become more complicated. William's household felt the effect of it in the form of increased loyalty from the staff, who had been watching to see how he handled exactly this kind of situation. The aides and private secretaries and protection officers who dedicate their professional lives to people like William spend a great deal of time assessing character, because their ability to do their jobs depends entirely on their understanding of the person they serve. When William acted with decisiveness and clarity, when he demonstrated that protecting his children was something he would do even when it was internally complicated, it generated a specific kind of trust in the people around him. Anne, for her part, moved through the period in the manner she moves through everything, with forward momentum and without visible signs of internal turbulence. She attended her engagements. She did her work. She gave no interviews and issued no statements and appeared at the appropriate public occasions with exactly the level of engagement those occasions required. But the people who knew her well, who had watched her for decades, and could read the particular language of her expressions and her silences, noticed something. In the weeks after William's decision, when she was photographed alongside him at various family and royal occasions, there was something in the way she positioned herself relative to him that was different from what it had been before. Something slightly more deliberate, something that communicated, not in words and not in grand gestures, but in the quiet vocabulary of physical presence and royal body language, that what William had done had her full and unequivocal support. This is how influence moves inside the British royal family, not in speeches, not in policy, in positioning, in who stands next to whom, in which conversations happen and which ones are conspicuously absent, in the arrangement of presences and absences that anybody who understands the institution can read as clearly as any printed statement. For Freddie Parker Bowles himself, the practical reality of the decision was presumably significant in the specific way that significant things are significant to teenagers, immediately and personally, and without the long-view perspective that adults sometimes use to make painful things more bearable. He was a young person who had been present in a certain world, and then, through an incident and its consequences, found that world's door had closed. That is not a small thing regardless of the circumstances around it. The question of what he understood about why it happened, what he was told, and by whom and in what terms, is not something the family would ever put into a public record. These are the conversations that happen in private homes, between parents and children, in the particular uncomfortable language of explaining institutional consequences to someone who is not yet fully an institution. Laura Lopes, his mother, was placed in a position of extraordinary difficulty. She is a private person by choice and by temperament, someone who has always maintained meaningful distance from the formal machinery of royal life, specifically, because she understood that distance was healthy and necessary for her and for her children. Suddenly that distance was not something she was choosing, it was being defined from the other side of the equation. She could not challenge it publicly without creating a story that would be far more damaging to her son than the original exclusion. She could express her pain to her mother. She could manage, in the way that parents always manage when their children are hurt by something they do not entirely control, the daily business of being present and reassuring and steady. But the situation itself was not something she had the power to change. There were people inside and outside royal circles who heard about what had happened and believed William had gone too far. That excluding a teenager, whatever the incident, whatever the circumstances, from a family space was disproportionate. That the right response was a conversation, a reprimand, an acknowledgement and an apology and a period of adjustment, not a permanent geographic restriction. These people had a point, at least in the abstract, in the way that measured responses always have a point in the abstract. What they perhaps did not fully account for was the specific weight of what it means to be Prince George. To be a 13-year-old boy who will one day be King of England, who has been raised with enormous care and considerable sacrifice toward that future, who cannot simply be allowed to navigate difficult experiences with other young people in the normal way because nothing about his life is the normal way. His dignity is not only personal. His well-being is not only a family matter. His sense of himself, of his security in the spaces he inhabits, has institutional significance in a way that no one outside his parents can fully appreciate. William understood this. Catherine understood this. And the decision William made, however privately painful for some of the people it affected, was made in the full and clear knowledge that his first responsibility was to the boy in his care, and that the institution and the family and the complicated interior politics of all of it came after that. What was coming next, as the weeks passed and the quiet realignment inside the royal household continued, was a public moment that would force something hidden into something visible. A ceremony, an occasion, an event at which the geography of who stood where and who stood with whom would tell a story that no one inside the family had officially agreed to tell. Those moments happen in royal life with a regularity that outsiders often miss. The cameras look for smiles and waves. Those who understand the institution look for what is missing, for who did not arrive, for the expression on the face of someone who was not supposed to be expressing anything. For the brief, unguarded exchange between two people that lasts only a second and says everything. That moment was approaching, and the people who knew what had happened inside Windsor were watching. The royal calendar does not stop for internal complexity. It never has. Whatever is happening inside the private chambers and private conversations of the family, the public face of the monarchy continues to appear at its scheduled moments. The dedications and the commemorations and the garden parties and the carefully choreographed occasions that have their roots in centuries of practice and fulfill their function regardless of what is happening behind the scenes. For everyone involved in what had unfolded at Windsor Castle and in the weeks that followed, this was both a pressure and, in its way, a discipline. You could not remain entirely inside the difficulty because the calendar pulled you out of it. You had to appear. You had to function. You had to manage the interior, whether of everything you were carrying, and present the exterior composure that the role required. William appeared at his engagements with the same focused, forward-facing presence he always brings to them. He is a man who has learned, through long practice and through the specific instruction of a lifetime inside this institution, how to be fully present at a public moment while carrying something private that no one in the room would ever know about. He shook hands and delivered remarks and stood in the particular upright, attentive posture that his role requires, and no one watching him in those weeks would have had any idea that he had recently made a decision that had quietly reconfigured a small but significant part of the family's internal landscape. Catherine was aware of everything. Of course she was. There is no significant decision in William's world that does not include her, not because she is required to approve it, but because they operate as a genuine unit, which is one of the less celebrated but more important facts about the Wales marriage. When William had been thinking through his response to the Windsor incident, Catherine had been part of that thinking. Her perspective on what had happened to George, her understanding as a mother of what her son needed and what the situation required, had been woven into William's decision-making from the beginning. She was not a passive recipient of what he decided. She was a full participant in the decision itself. And in the public weeks that followed, she carried herself with the same considered composure that has always been one of her most remarkable qualities. The ability to be warm and engaged, and apparently entirely uncomplicated in public while simultaneously managing the full weight of everything that a life at the center of the British monarchy actually involves. Anne continued to be Anne. She attended the engagements she was scheduled to attend, managed her extraordinary workload with the efficiency that has always defined her approach to royal service, and maintained the particular silence about private family matters that she has always maintained with an almost perfect consistency. But there were moments, at a joint royal appearance in early spring, at a commemorative event attended by several senior royals, when the dynamic between her and William was visible to those paying close enough attention, not in any dramatic way, in the way that alignment between two people who trust each other always becomes visible if you know what you are looking for, a shared look across a room. a moment of positioning that was slightly more deliberate than the occasion itself required. A silence that communicated, between two people who have never needed many words to understand each other, that they were in full accord. Camilla, for her part, did what Camilla has always done when situations are painful and public retreat is not an option, she continued. She appeared at her engagements. She stood beside Charles at the occasions that required her presence. She fulfilled the obligations of her role with the particular resilience that has always characterized her approach to difficulty. There was nothing in her public presentation that would have told an outside observer anything at all about what she was carrying privately. But to the people inside the institution who had been watching this situation unfold, who understood the full shape of what had happened and what it meant, there was something visible in the particular care she took, the additional precision in her composure, the slight but unmistakable quality of controlled effort in moments where she would normally have been entirely relaxed. She was managing something. Everyone who knew her well enough understood that. The relationship between Camilla and William has always been more complicated than the official photographs suggest. She married his father. She is, in the formal structure of the institution, his stepmother. But William was a grown man with his own household and his own children, and his own clearly defined position in the line of succession long before Camilla's role in the family was officially formalized. The dynamic between them has never been the simple step-parent-stepchild relationship that the title might imply. It has been something more negotiated, more careful, built around a mutual understanding of the space they each occupy and the limits of what each of them can ask of the other. For years, that negotiated space had functioned reasonably well. The decision William made about Freddie Parker Bowles had changed the coordinates of it. Not catastrophically, the institution is far too practiced at absorbing change for that, but meaningfully, in a way that both of them felt and neither of them would ever address directly in any setting where someone else might be listening. Within the family, the children were the constant. George and Charlotte and Louis continued their lives, school, activities, the specific business of being children who are also, in an institutional sense, enormously significant, with the protection that both William and Catherine work extremely hard to provide them. The purpose of William's decision, at its most fundamental level, had been to protect that continuity, to ensure that the spaces his children inhabited remained spaces where their dignity was secure. Whether he was entirely successful at that, whether children who are aware, at some level, that something significant has shifted, can simply absorb that awareness and move forward, is a question only they will be able to answer in their own time and their own terms. George, at 13, was old enough to understand more than very young children understand, but young enough that the full institutional dimension of what his father had done was probably still partially abstract to him. What he likely understood, in the immediate and personal way that teenagers understand the things that directly affect their lives, was that something had happened, and his father had responded to it, and the response had been decisive and clear. That knowledge, that his father would act, is not a small thing for a child who occupies the position George occupies. It is, in many ways, the most important thing a parent can communicate. Not through conversation, not through explanation, but through action. Through making it unmistakably clear that the protection is real, that it is not conditional, and that it does not stop at the borders of institutional convenience. As the months moved through the spring of 2025 and into summer, the situation settled into itself in the way that all significant private events eventually settle, not resolved, not forgotten, but integrated. The daily mechanics of the royal household continued. The public calendar continued. The institution, which has survived things far larger than this, continued. And the people involved, William and Catherine, Camilla and Charles, Anne in her particular position of quiet alignment with what had been decided, continued alongside it, carrying what they were carrying, doing what their roles required, managing the private complexity with the professional composure that all of them, whatever their individual history and whatever their individual feelings about the situation, had been trained to maintain. What the episode left behind was not visible in any public record. There is no official document that describes it. No royal correspondent has been given a full briefing. The palace has not commented, and it will not comment, and the people inside it who know the complete shape of what happened are not going to explain it to anyone who might write it down. What it left behind instead was something interior to the institution, a shift in understanding, a redrawn map of where the weight and the authority and the genuine decision-making power inside the family currently resided. William had demonstrated something in those weeks that would not be forgotten by the people around him. Not his willingness to be harsh, because the decision he made was not primarily about harshness, it was about clarity, about drawing a line that was real rather than suggested, about making the institution and the family understand that the protection he offered his children was not a sentiment he expressed at speeches and charity dinners, but a fact he backed up with action when action was called for. Leaders inside institutions, and the British monarchy is, at its core, an institution, are ultimately defined not by their statements, but by their choices in the moments when choices have consequences. This had been one of those moments. Anne had known that. She had recognized it with the clarity of someone who has spent more than 5 decades watching people inside this institution rise to moments and fail to rise to moments, who has seen what the difference looks like and what it produces over time. Her alignment with William in this episode was not a political calculation. She is not a political calculator in the conventional sense. She has never needed to be, because her position within the institution has always been secure in the way that genuine competence and genuine dedication make things secure, independent of the shifting weather of palace politics. What she gave William in this episode was something more straightforward than politics. She gave him the confirmation of her respect, and from Anne, that is not a small thing. For Camilla, the months ahead would require the continued management of something painful. The situation with Freddie Parker Bowles was not going to simply disappear from her interior landscape, because the external situation had been resolved and closed. She is a grandmother. That relationship does not turn off when an institutional decision creates distance. She would continue to be present in her grandson's life in the ways she could be, in the spaces and contexts that were available to her outside of Windsor. She would manage, because she has always managed, the particular art of maintaining warmth and connection across complicated terrain. But something in the specific geography of the family had changed. Something in the understanding of where her influence reached and where it did not had been clarified. Not cruelly, not publicly, but unmistakably. King Charles, watching all of this from his particular vantage point, had made his own quiet choice in stepping back and allowing it to unfold as it had. That choice communicated something, too, about the degree to which he understood that the future of the institution was already, in the most meaningful sense, in William's hands. Charles is a king. He is the reigning monarch. The crown sits on his head and not on his son's. But institutions are living things, and the living thing that is the British monarchy had, through this episode and the way it was handled, signaled something about where its center of gravity was moving. Toward William. Toward the household William and Catherine had built. Toward the set of values, protection, clarity, dignity, decisive and unapologetic loyalty to the people he loved, that William had demonstrated he was willing to act on, even when acting was uncomfortable. That is ultimately what this story is about, not the specific details of an incident among young people inside a castle, not the mechanics of an exclusion communicated through private channels, not even the complicated interior feelings of a grandmother who cannot publicly contest a decision made by the future king. It is about what it means to lead. About what it looks like when someone in an institution of this size and this significance makes a choice that is internally costly and externally invisible and entirely right. About the particular kind of courage it takes to protect the things that matter when the things that matter are surrounded by the enormous, elaborate, beautiful, and sometimes suffocating machinery of one of the world's most ancient and scrutinized institutions. Windsor Castle stands today exactly as it has always stood. The flags fly according to their schedules. The ceremonies happen. The calendar turns. The family that lives within its extraordinary geography continues to present to the world the face that the world is permitted to see. And inside it, in the private rooms and private conversations and private understandings that no camera will ever reach, the real story of what it means to be that family continues to unfold, as it always has, and as it always will, one quiet, consequential decision at a time.